Welcome back. This time we're going to look at the realities of daily life for Mesopotamian women and some of the more important women to emerge out of Mesopotamia. When we look at the reality of Mesopotamian women, it doesn't always mesh with the images we get out of religious texts. So we have to really be careful. It doesn't even match entirely with what the kinds of restrictions that you see in law codes. So you have to really be careful. One of the things that we can say is that women and men were considered distinct. And now that sounds kind of obvious, and why would I even say that? But when you get into the Greek text, there's this entire debate about whether men and women are separate species, or if they are not separate species, if they are in fact the same species. Are they all the same sex? That there's not any difference between men? I mean, there's all kinds of things that, and we'll talk about that more when we get into Greece. But when you get into Mesopotamia, they do think that men and women are distinct. That usually they refer to men as right and women as left. There doesn't seem to be anything that says that one or the other is superior, but simply they use kind of different directions to kind of denote them. In literature, you have a distinctly different dialect called emesal, which is used when women are speaking. Once again, just denoting that women are different than men. And when you're telling a story orally, you don't want to say he said, she said constantly. So using this different dialect was a way for oral storytellers to very clearly delineate when a man was talking and when a woman was talking in their story. Women had certain symbols associated with them, often spindles and pins or mirrors. These were very similar sorts of things. In other words, things that had to do with the household, had to do with household work like spinning and making cloth. Mesopotamian women liked their accessories. They wore a fair amount of jewelry. Rings like this that were silver were very important. They tended to be linked to bride wealth or bride price, meaning the money that came from the groom's family to be invested in a new couple. When we look at Queen Puabi of Ur, we see her adornments being very, very elaborate. And
Puabi was dressed very elaborately with a headdress and a beaded cloak. The headdress had multiple parts. At the very top, we find a comb, kind of like a Spanish comb, that's decorated with star-like rosettes. That's in gold, and it had a pin on it that stuck down into her wig or into her hair. She also wore wreaths around her head, and her hairline was a wreath that was made out of flowers, lapis lazuli and agate, blue and white, which is a wonderful contrast, as well as gold. And then below that were wreaths of leaves, local leaves to Ur, poplar leaves and willow leaves. Under the wreaths were her hair was wrapped in gold ribbons. One of the ribbons was over 30 feet long. She also had hair rings. Her hair probably was pulled through rings. They're on the side of her head, and very large lunate earrings. Interestingly, the earrings, which are very large, were probably not that heavy. And they either were stuck through her ears, she may have had pierced ears, or they may have actually hung over the ear as well. Below her neck, she wore several necklaces, very well crafted, again with the same combination of gold and silver and lapis and carnelian and agate, and several necklaces, and then under the necklaces, an incredible beaded cloak with over 50 strings of beads. And again, you see the same colors, the lapis, the agate, the carnelian, the gold and silver. It all clearly was created to go together. Ur was an interesting site. Mesopotamia was interesting in that the soil was rich, there was plenty of water, but there were no natural resources like minerals semi-precious stones. So when we look at Puabi's jewelry, we see a trade network. The lapis lazuli in antiquity came from only one place, which was Badakhshan, Afghanistan. So we know the lapis was traded from Afghanistan. The carnelian and the agate probably came from perhaps the Iranian plateau. Gold and silver, again, none of these things were available locally. The gold and silver would have come from the Iranian plateau, perhaps Afghanistan as well.
Puabi, you can see how completely elaborate they are. And I'll give you one more image of it right here with all of the pieces that were just described. But these rings that you see down here could also be on a regular woman, could in fact be the silver that was part of her bridewell that's now been made into rings that are on her cloak, that are on her ears, that are on her arms. Marriage was central to most women's lives. Most girls married somewhere between ages 14 and 20. Men were usually in their late 20s or early 30s. They would have done some military service most likely before that point. There are evidences of love poetry and wooing in Mesopotamia. They do write these love poems, but there's a lot of concern about the context. Most of that seems to be kind of after the marriage. It doesn't seem to be a courtship period, because so much of this marriage was in fact really patriarchal. Now, remember what we said, patriarchal means rule not by us men, but by fathers. And in this case, it's very, very clear. Marriage was arranged by the fathers of both parties. His father and her father arranged this. Now, if he's on a second marriage, then maybe he's arranging his own with her father. But most likely, it's the dads of both parties. Marriage was referred to as umatan or hatadmutum, which basically means that the man enters into a relationship with another man's family. In other words, we're investing and we're creating this bond between families, and the woman is the one who's creating that avenue. And that makes a lot of sense when we get into some of the questions about property rights possibly being tied and use of land rights being tied to women. This was largely a bride price society. You saw silver and food and cattle and land use rights be exchanged in turn for women. The amounts that varied from one strata of society to another. But most of the time, 5 or 10 shekels of silver or higher increments in those, because those rings that I talked about usually were made out of about 5 shekels worth of silver. And so you've got this, she's going to wear part of that bride price. She's going to wear that price on her body. And so that's why you often figured it out in those. Sometimes that money wasn't given back to the bride. A lot of the time it was. Sometimes if it wasn't rings, it was made into coins, and the coins were put in kind of the bottom hem of the skirt. Many of you may have heard the story about the woman with the lost coin, and that the coins were probably the ones tied to a cloth, and she's going hunting for the one. Well, that cloth and those coins were her dowry money, or her bride price money. That was part of her wealth. Now, and you can see here, this is another representation of probably the coins and how they're being used in terms of jewelry and adornments. Now, I should also mention, as we're talking about bride wealth and bride price, it's also thought that part of what happens here is that there may have been a question of land use rights that is transferring. Not the land itself, not necessarily the ownership, but land use that goes with the women. And that's more of an issue amongst the Hebrews that we'll look at in more detail there. But there seems to be a question about land use being tied to the person of the woman gave you the authority to use a specific plot of land. Marriage in Mesopotamia is a very critical part of life. Marriage required a contract, usually oral, unless we're talking the upper stratosphere of society, then you won't have to have you will have to have a written contract. But most of the time they were oral agreements, maybe a handshake, sorts of things. Then the bride price must be exchanged. Then you have a feast, a hearth ritual, and intercourse completes the deal. Without the consummation of the marriage, consummation between the husband and wife, the marriage is not valid. Women were going to go through a hearth ritual that involved anointing, that brought them into the new family unit they're going to be in. This is a patrilocal society. She's going to be part of this new family. There is going to be a lot of a feast, sometimes 3 to 5 days. The larger feast for an upper class family might be 7 days. The poorer the family, the more this resembled a sale. We've got to get rid of a daughter and bring more coffers in. We see, in fact, in Assyria, where women have fewer and fewer rights, that the term for marriage, kahafeh, was very much referred to the delivery of immovables. Once it's yours, you can't move it. We actually see among some poorer families a practice of adoption. Adoption is usually is only of adult males if you're in case you're in need of an heir. But we actually see a practice of adoption with women where a father or a brother will, and often it seems to have been brothers, who will sell a sister or a daughter to someone else, kind of at a lower kind of bargain basement rate, I guess. I don't know. And then that person would then marry that woman off to someone else and receive greater bride price for her from someone else. Now, most of the time, this is going to be a monogamous marriage. In fact, often we find in the written contracts we do have very specified reasons that have to have taken place in order for a second wife to be allowed. A second wife is allowed, meaning a second wife while the first wife is still in the household, if the first wife has had 3 or more years of childlessness. And it looks like there's nothing else to be done, certainly not in their world, and so you're going to need another wife to perpetuate the line. Chronic disease or disability by the wife where she's just bedfast. There's too much to be done in a household. You need that married woman. If a woman comes into marriage in a Naditu status, meaning she's going to be a bride of God, and therefore she's promised to the temple, she's not supposed to have sexual relations, but she's got a dowry and other pieces, and she's still going to be part of this household and run it, but she has this other vow that she's making, then she usually brings a second woman with her that bears the children. It's a really interesting kind of arrangement. A status of a wife improved after the birth of a child because at that point she has proven her ability to further the line, and all of a sudden she is up in status. The threats of childbirth were actually attributed to this really scary looking lion-headed demon that was very much feared in Mesopotamia. The threats of childbirth we've talked about already, and that is something that's very much a reality. We've got lots of hymns, lots of amulets, we have Akkadian rituals about what you do to make certain childbirth goes well, and that Lamashtu will not attack you. A wife with a child was not easily divorced because she had proven her worth, and you're not going to get rid of her lightly. What led to divorce? Well, lots of pieces here. It varied depending upon where you are and when you were, how easily done this was, and what kinds of rights women had. But one of the things that's interesting from Babylon is that we can see that it carried a penalty if you did it. It carried a penalty for both men and women. It was not something that was thought of as good for the society as a whole. And when land use rights are involved with this, and land has changed hands, not just cash, but land, it is a messy piece of business. So what could do this? Well, we have an old Babylonian letter that reveals the concerns of husbands that one husband's writing to another. Well, if you're worried about your wife, has she done any of these things? If she hasn't, then you have nothing to worry about. Did your lady perform black magic? Did she pass a secret word from the palace? This is dealing with the queenship level of things. Did somebody else open the thighs of your lady? Mesopotamian language tends to be very, very blunt when it comes to anything dealing with sexual intercourse. When they're discussing the issue of virgins, it's actually explicit that a penis has not entered my vagina. That's what the phrasing is that blunt. Did your lady do anything wrong against her lord? And if she hasn't done these things, then you don't need to be even thinking about trying to get rid of her. Now, what were the list? Well, if she committed adultery, yes. If she refused to cohabit with you, she wasn't a virgin. She has disease, or she's done a lot of bad behavior. You're going to see the term gadabout in some of these. In other words, she's up to no good. And there is a consideration here. But there were also reasons for a woman to bring suit in many places in Mesopotamia. We know this in Syria. We see this in Babylon. We see this in a couple of other places. That if he refused to live with her, if he was convicted of bad behavior, or, and here's an interesting one, if he had been gone too long. Now, that may mean that he had been probably captured as a prisoner of war, and it seemed very unlikely that he was going to return. So, desertion, or just simply he's gone on a prisoner of war, and I need to get on with the business of living. There are things to be provided for in my household, and so I cannot continue in this situation. One of the things when we look at women, we find that their work is, they are very, very busy. Women are integral to life in Mesopotamia, as they are in any world. They are the masters of the spindle, of cloth making, belongs to the women. Grinding flour. These things were the routines of every single household. And it's going to take the average woman to kind of give you some ideas about what life is. If you've got a small, about 2x3 piece of mat that you're weaving, that's going to take one woman weaving about 2 to 3 weeks of work to get that all finished. So we've got all of these women. It's going to take them 2 to 3 hours to actually grind enough flour to feed the whole household for the next couple of days. So this is one of those things that this is a constant sort of thing. They did some of this almost every single day because there was a lot of work to do. Think about what has to be done in order to cook a meal from scratch. You've got to go from flour, you've got to go from wheat to flour. You've got to go from killed animal to meat that's cooked and flavored. All of these are parts of it. I've got to harvest vegetables. I've got to clean them. I've got to chop them. I've got to prepare them. And I've got to do this all over an open hearth flame. Most free women moved in society without veils. The veiling seems to only have happened in Assyria, and as we talked about in the veils then and some other things. We have an occupation list from about 2400 BC that lists what women and men did. Women were involved in weaving, olive oil, boat towing, midwives, being wet nurses. They did, and this is one description of some of the various types of women's work. They dug canals and were musicians and singers. They were alewives, meaning that they owned taverns. Now, the trouble with women was, by law in places like Babylon and Ur, most women couldn't work about 6 days a month. They were called, because they had been stricken by the weapon. Now, in case you're going, what in the world does that mean? It means that they had their period and they were menstruating. And because they were menstruating, they were either in pain or they're also they're bleeding. Therefore, it's not really proper for them to be involved in the making of a substance like olive oil, and they're really not going to want to go be a singer and dancer at this point. This is not going to work. Because of the fact that they couldn't do this, this is one of the ways in which we see the kind of secondary status a little bit, that they were given about half the ration of men who did the same thing, like, say, boat towing. Um, Often the wages were paid not always in money but in kind, and so you have about 30 liters of barley monthly. Barley is the lesser grain, it's the cheaper grain. As this indicates, women were the ones who purchased slaves and often hired workers for the household. They managed household finances. Now, they could not be a witness in court, regardless of their status. Rich, poor, free, didn't matter. They could not be a witness in court. But they could acquire wealth and often did in their own name. They could transact business in their own names. They managed a household as a widow with children. We know this from several records that they could in fact do this. It tended to vary a little bit about a widow, whether or not the widow, what happened with them. If it was a young widow without children, she usually returned to her father's house. If she was a woman with children who were not quite grown, she usually managed that household herself. But if her husband dies and her children are grown, she usually went to the house of one of her children. And now, one of the things that's interesting is the position of the Naditu, which I mentioned a moment ago in terms of these women who get married but don't expect to have sex. The Naditu were considered to be the brides of God. And now we got to be real careful not to kind of equate them with Catholic nuns, which is kind of where our brains go. This practice seems to have begun with the Amorites, who have these brides of God who are dedicated to the temple but are not symbolized by the temple prostitute symbol where they're holding on to their breasts. The Naditu were fascinating because if a woman was designated as a Naditu and she went to work in the temple, or even if she didn't and got married, her dowry, she was given a dowry, and any monies and any land use rights that went with her returned to the family upon her death. There was no letting go of something if it went into the household. In Sipar, the Naditu create a scholarly community of women, and that is going to become rather important for Mesopotamia overall. From that community, we see women moving out from Sipar to other places in Mesopotamia. We see a court physician in Lagash. Now, think about this. We have a female physician in Lagash sometime in, say, the 1700s, 1600s BC, which is a pretty early time frame for that. We see them as administrators in Mari. We see them as scribes. Not as many of them are going to be women who are scribes, but the reality is we see women in positions of authority and prestige in court life, and they maintain a community between them. There's a lot of letters between these women that we still have, and so this is a very important community of women who are actually going to be involved in the running of political and economic life. There were women with articulate power who had expressly designated jobs that they did. Now, the first ones of these are women who we would think of, royal women of the ruling house. You often had a wife of a ruler who could serve as a regent, not for a small child, but if her husband was out of town. Her husband is off fighting the various wars, so she's taking care of business at home. And this seems to have been kind of equated with household management. There were regular religious rites that had to be performed by the woman of the house every single month. She goes through these rituals. She performs some sacrifices, other things to the gods. We also see some really interesting females in terms of whether or not they held actual outright political authority. Now, one of the most interesting of these is Queen Puabi of the first dynasty of Ur, which is very, very early. It's about 2600 BC.
Well, there were certainly powerful women at Ur. There were certain positions, and I know the most about the city of Ur, so we're talking about them mostly, that were female and that were very high-powered. We have the name of Puabi, and she was a queen, so she was wearing a cylinder seal that listed her name and title. So it's Puabi Erish, Puabi the queen. We date her grave at least to around 2450 BCE. She may have ruled slightly before that, and the cylinder seal does not mention a king, her husband, which may mean that she ruled in her own right. Normally, queen cylinder seals do say, Queen so-and-so, wife of so-and-so the king. But hers just says Puabi queen, and that may mean that, like Hatshepsut in Egypt or Elizabeth I in England or something like that, she ruled on her own. We can't prove it, but it sort of sounds like it.
And we're going to look at a clip on Puabi. In addition to Puabi, we have also got the tantalizing evidence of Kuaba or Kukbao. You'll see both names for her. Of the third dynasty of Kish, a different city in Sumeria. Sometime around 2450 BC, so slightly after Puabi. And what's interesting about Kuabi is she's actually in the Sumerian king list. She's given 100-year-long reign, which is actually a very good sign. Now, do we think she reigned for 100 years? No. But numbers in Sumeria and Mesopotamia and amongst the Hebrews had different significances than they do today. Remember that they're not using Arabic numerals because they haven't been invented yet. They're using word numbers, and words have symbolic meanings. And so the longer I give your rule, the better a ruler you were. So if you only got like 8 years, then you're a terrible, terrible ruler. Now, if you get 100, obviously you're a gifted ruler. So that means that she's in this king list, and she has a pretty significant one. And this alabaster head that you see here, what is considered to be of Kuba'u. And she seems to have been associated with a tale that she was an alewife. In other words, she ran a tavern first and moves up through ingenuity and her own capabilities to ruling the city of Kish. It's difficult on some levels to know exactly who she was. Some of her work, a good deal of it, was in fact destroyed by Sargon when he came into the area. Eventually, by the 1400s, about 1,000 years after her own death, she is actually being worshipped as a goddess in Carchemish. And this is one of the seals of her at Carchemish that is honoring her as a goddess of the people. Now, you also get these women who were like Enheduanna. Now, Entu is a term meaning a priestess. And the most famous of these high priestesses is of a ruling house. And she's the daughter of Sargon I, the very same one who destroys Kubaba. Enheduanna is quite famous. I have a dear friend who named a dog, her greyhound, after her. Enheduanna was a bright woman, and like so many of these upper class women, she could in fact read and write. She's going to become a royal priestess of Ishtar, or an Entu, and the Enhe at the beginning of her name probably means something to that. In fact, we're not certain that Enheduanna was her name at all. It seems like it might have been a title, because Aunt Iniana is one name for Ishtar, and it may have simply mean that she was the high priestess of Ishtar, and that may be what this is. We have a seal of hers. This is a seal that is considered to be the moon seal because it's in the shape of a moon. And it has Enheduanna on it. It has her name all around the edges of it so that we know this actually belonged to her. And one of the striking things about this is not from her time frame. It's from a period that is later than hers, where her name and her hymns and her writings are well known much about 1,000 years later, much like Kubagba. She is considered to be one of the first systematic theologians in world history, and certainly the first named poetess that we have. She is going to write a series of hymns to Ishtar and discuss who Ishtar is, and she's going to be the beginning of a line of these Intus. There will be 13 more royal priestesses following in her footsteps. Now, why is that important? Because what Enheduanna is going to be able to do is to rearrange some of the land use rights to actually help her father's reign. Her father is going to create a significant kingdom in the south. And as a result of that, she's often going to be ruling in one place while dad is off somewhere else. And because of that, one of the things that we see is these royal priestesses begin to step into this role as kind of regents for their fathers, dispensing land, dispensing goods, dispensing justice. And it makes them incredibly powerful women. And really, Sargon the First of Akkad is going to, like I say, he's going to have a significant empire. And it's through these royal priestesses. Enheduanna far outlives her father. In fact, she serves his successors. And the same is going to be true for these other women. And they serve to create stability in the region, even when the ruler is dead. And that's going to be a significant role for women in Mesopotamia. So before we're tempted to say women were oppressed everywhere, we need to take a closer look. Because what we find quickly in Mesopotamia is that the images that we see of women who are capricious and evil and can't be trusted with Tiamat and Ishtar are not sign of what we see here. Here's the high priestess of Ishtar being well trusted to be a regent in the area. So we see a lot of interesting dimensions to what women did in these areas. And you've got a law code discussion that you're going to be doing online, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you do. And we'll see you next time for Egypt.